Tonight, I want to talk about the third foundation of mindfulness, which is mindfulness of mind or mindfulness of mental states. In Pali, the term for this is chitta, so it would be mindfulness of chitta. The way chitta translates it can translate a few different ways, depending on who you're asking. Generally, it's translated as mind or heart-mind, which I think is fairly helpful. Stephen Batchelor actually translates it as soul. The Satipatthana, where this teaching comes from, is pretty much like the instruction book for meditation. It's like, here's how you do it, from the start to the finish. And it starts with the body and ends with dhammas, which is mindfulness of basically the truth. So tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about how thoughts form as we move from the first foundation into the third, about what my interpretation of this activity of mindfulness of mind actually is. I'd like to talk about what the Buddha said about training the mind towards this practice. And a little bit about how, by practicing this, we can change our perception and the way that we interact with the world. There's a particularly useful quote at the beginning of the Dhammapada that I think is helpful. And the Dhammapada is just a series of short vignettes, dharmets, if you will, about different areas of the Dharma. But it starts with this. Mind precedes thought. Mind is their chief. Their quality is made by mind. If with a base mind one speaks or acts, through that suffering follows him like a wheel follows the ox's foot. Mind precedes thoughts. Mind is their chief. Their quality is made of mind. If with pure mind one speaks or acts, through that happiness follows him like a shadow which does not depart. So, our interpretation of our thoughts is really everything. And I think that mindfulness of mind, it can kind of be a little bit clunky of a statement. It doesn't really describe what we're trying to do here. When they're saying mindfulness of mind, what we're really looking at is the attitudinal lens through which we view our experience. So it's like, what attitude do we have? You know, are we viewing this from a place of greed? Are we viewing our experience to a place of aversion and hatred or anger? Are we viewing from a place of delusion? Are we not acting with wisdom? So it's really not so much the content of the thoughts, but the lens through which we're processing the thought. It's the attitude with which we're holding towards the thought. And so in the first foundation, like I said, the first foundation is mindfulness of body. And so that includes the sense doors. And the sense doors are all 5 normal sense doors plus mind. So there's 6 sense doors as far as we're regarded in Buddhism. So experience comes to us through the sense doors, and we gain experience through empirical data coming in through our sense doors, right? What that does is then that leads to the second foundation, which is feeling tone. This feeling tone is just in the psychology world, they use phrases like hedonic tone or valence, like I spoke about last week. And that just really means the qualitative tone of your experience, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And so this feeling tone, this is conditioned. Like we're going to react with a positive or with a pleasant, unpleasant feeling towards every situation. It's going to be one of the 3. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And so it's our interpretation of these feeling tones that give rise to our mental states. And then we have to view what attitude are we coming through with. Like I said, are we operating from a place of greed? Are we operating from a place of hatred? Are we operating from a place of delusion? The Buddha referred to these as wholesome and unwholesome mind states, but again, I feel that can be a little bit clunky. I really prefer skillful or unskillful. I think that works a lot better. Are we acting skillfully? Are we acting unskillfully as we go through our lives? Has anyone ever acted in a way that they might call unskillful?
Never. Kidding me.
I thought I was the only one that had done that. Kidding. I see it in everyone. And I only see it in other people because I know it exists in myself. So when we're viewing through this attitudinal lens, like we're looking at the world, and it really gives us a deep insight into our motivations. Like, why are we acting in the way we're acting? Are we acting from a place of resentment? Are we acting from a place of lack? Are we clinging? Are we grasping for things that we don't have? Are we trying to cling to things that are leaving us? And it gives us a really deep insight into our motivations and just the way that we interact with the world. So we have to ask ourselves, is there anger present in the mind? And this is the way the Buddha lays this out. In the Satipatthana, he asks the rhetorical questions. And how bhikkhus, and in this case bhikkhus, it translates as monks normally, but in this sense it really means anyone that's committed to this practice, so it means all of us. It says, "In how bhikkhus does one live contemplating the mind? Herein, bhikkhus, one knows the mind with lust as with lust, the mind without lust as without lust, the mind with hate as with hate, the mind without hate as without hate, and the mind with ignorance is without ignorance." And so we're asked to examine the presence and the absence of these states, right? So he says that when there's lust or greed present in the mind, one knows that there is present in the mind, that lust is present in the mind. And this can be kind of useful. It was written initially and it was translated as lust, which I think in a monastic sense makes a lot of sense, because if you're a monastic, lust is going to be probably pretty heavy on the mind. But I think we can include that with anything. Like, are we grasping for anything? Do we, it doesn't matter what the thing is. Like, are we grasping? Are we pulling things towards us? Are we trying to cling to more? Are we pushing things away? Are we being averse to situations? Are we not wanting to be involved in situations? Or are we just kind of floating through life and fast forward? I think a lot of times that's mostly what we're doing, is just fast forwarding through life. We're just not even aware. And I think that's where the delusion comes in. It's just not being mindful of our experience. We're just not paying attention. And I think that's really just human nature to do that. And so we're asked to look at both the presence and the absence of these states. Is there greed present in the mind? Is there greed absent in the mind? And I think, a lot of times we're pretty good at knowing when there's greed in the mind. I think we're pretty solid with that. Like, oh, I want something. I don't even know what it is, but I want something. That's me a lot of the times. Like, I'll just be like, just feel that restless feeling. I don't even know what it is. I know I want to do something, or I want something. You ever go shopping and like not even need anything? You're just like, I know if I bought something that might help me feel better. Yeah. Or aversion. I think we know when we're being averse to things, when we're like, get me the fuck out of here. Like, when you're standing behind that guy that has like 90 lottery tickets in the line, you're like, oh my God, I am not content with the present time experience whatsoever. Please, anything but this. Couldn't I have come in 5 minutes earlier? No, you couldn't have. Absolutely not. So we're used to knowing when we're being greedy, when we're being averse, but I don't think we're really used to paying attention to when we're not doing it. I think that's something that's often missed out on. I mean, how often are you like, I'm not mad at all. Everything's just perfect. Couldn't imagine anything being any better than it is right now. So we train ourselves to look for these qualities, the presence and the absence of these qualities. And he actually lists like 8 particular mental states in this particular sutta to pay attention to. There's about 5 unwholesome mental states and about 3 wholesome ones. And the 3 wholesome ones are way at the end, and they're really more related to the practice than anything else. It's like whether the mind is liberated. It's like, nope, not yet. Hopefully I'll get there soon. I'll just keep sitting on this cushion and maybe one day, right? So we're just not trained to look for the absence of things. I know I don't ever really look for how often do I think of, I don't want anything right now. There's nothing I could possibly want. Like, that's just never been my experience. So, I keep meditating, and hopefully one day that'll change, but maybe not. So, in the absence of greed, I think there's not just the absence. I think there's also the presence of something else. And it's going to be the antithesis of whatever these unskillful states are. So if we're looking at the world through a lens of greed, well, the opposite of that would be a lens of generosity and gratitude. If we're looking at the world through a lens of hate, well, obviously the antidote for hate is loving kindness and compassion. So when we're in the absence of greed, we're acting from a place of generosity. We're not clinging to anything. We don't want anything. We're giving. When we're in the absence of aversion, we're being loving. We're being compassionate. We're being empathetic. And when we're in the absence of delusion, that's when we're operating from a place of wisdom, which I really think is probably the best place to operate from, because I've tried the other way and it didn't work out for me very well. A lot of bond money and a lot of lawyers involved in the unwise actions. But the Buddha says that whatever you frequently think and ponder upon, that will become the inclination of the mind. So as we look at the world through this framework and this lens of how am I viewing the world, what lens am I viewing the world through, it's helpful to look at it through a positive lens, I think, which in this world, in this day and age, in this culture, isn't always easy. I think we're fed a lot of negativity. And I think that a lot of us are subjected to a lot of negativity through media and just everyday life. And that tends to be what we think and ponder upon, because it's what we're surrounded with. We have roughly anywhere from 50,000 to 70,000 unique thoughts per day. So, and they're not our fault. Like, we're not the author of our thoughts. Thoughts, like every other process of the body, are completely autonomic. They're automatic. We can't control them. We're not the author. All we can do is look at them and go, ugh, gross. That's generally how I look at my thoughts anyway. A lot of them, like, oh, that's a stupid thing. Why was my brain even doing that? This stupid thing my brain is doing right now. But even that is like coming at myself with a place of judgment. And that's not what we want to do either. Because as I said, we're not the author of our thoughts. All we can do is look at the quality of our thoughts. And it's very important to not judge ourselves when we do have obtuse thoughts. When those weird, fucked up thoughts do pop up in our head, we have to go, okay, there it is. And just look at it as it is and fully know that that's it. And I think a lot of times people, especially in this practice, like to push away the negative thoughts rather than just sit with that, rather than be with them. And that's, I think, where we get into a place of spiritual bypass. Because if we're just pushing away the negative thoughts, like, oh, I don't want to think that, think a happy thought, we're not really honoring where that thought came from and really doing the investigation that needs to get to the root of why that thought was there in the first place. I think a lot of us, like I said, just the world being the negative place that it is, I think a lot of times we have these stories that we build up in our heads about situations and people and things, and they stick with us. And, we have a lot of historical wounds. So, yet again, not our fault. Honestly, it's not any of our faults. We're pre-programmed. Neuroscience calls this negativity bias. So we're going to remember all the bad stuff, and we're not going to remember any of the positive things. And Rick Hansen actually had a quote in his book, Buddha's Brain. It says, the mind is like Velcro for negative thoughts and like Teflon for positive ones. And that's a great thing, like many, many eons ago when we were on the Serengeti, like, sure, like, protect me, brain. I need some protection here. But I don't think that comes in really handy these days so much, like that fear-based mentality, that fight, flight, freeze. That's not really, doesn't seem very helpful in a lot of what we do. I mean, sometimes, sure. Absolutely, sometimes. I don't think it's really helpful all the time. I probably don't need to run out of the store screaming at just random times. It's probably not going to be helpful for me. But by paying attention to our thoughts and really like examining the content and the quality and noting the transience of thought itself, we're really given a deep insight into the imperfect, impermanent, impersonal nature of our thoughts. They're not us. Our thoughts are not ourselves. We're not the stories we've told ourselves. They're not permanent because they're in and they're out. Just like that. It's like, where did it go? And like I said, they're not perfect. I mean, if they were perfect, none of us would probably be here because we'd all just be out hanging out at the beach and having a great time. But I think a lot of us get wrapped up in the stories we tell ourselves. And there's a lot of judgment that gets involved with that. We judge ourselves for things of the past when we just simply didn't know any better. We judge ourselves for the thoughts that we have when we're not even the author of our thoughts. And so by paying attention to the transient nature of these thoughts, we learn to depersonalize them and not identify with our thoughts so much. So rather than one helpful trick that is really useful for me is rather than identifying with the emotion, just noting the emotion, rather than saying, I am angry, just being like, oh, there is anger present in the mind. Because I'm not personally angry, most of the time. Sometimes, sure, maybe. But I mean, still, it's not even me. It's the lens in which I'm viewing the world through, is that lens of anger, through that perceived transgression or whatever it was that caused that, So we have to look at how we're viewing the world. And I think this really puts the magnifying glass on Buddhist ethics. This is how we present ourselves ethically in the world. It's how are we going to act ethically in the world? Well, if we're acting through a lens of greed or hatred or delusion, it's not exactly going to be the most ethical behavior, probably. I mean, that's when we get into lying, cheating, and stealing, and all that other fun stuff that they talk about in so many religious texts and say that stuff's probably not good for us. And I think having a meditation practice really helps with that, because for me, having a meditation practice keeps me from doing a lot of probably ethically kind of iffy stuff, because generally, I don't know about y'all, but that's normally the first stuff that comes up when I'm sitting there meditating. It's like, ooh, I could have handled that better. That was not my best performance. And it also, one thing I read the other day that I found this was super cool is meditation actually shrinks the size of the amygdala. It shrinks the amygdala. So that fight, flight, or freeze response gets reduced, our reactivity gets reduced, just through the sheer practice of meditation, shrinking the size of our amygdala, which is pretty awesome. And so we're asked, like I said, to contemplate these factors: greed, hatred, delusion. And we're asked to contemplate them both internally and externally. Internally being ourselves, and externally in this context meaning that and other people. So when we're interacting with others, we through our insight, we can see whether they're acting from a place of greed or hatred or delusion, or whether they're acting in the opposite, in a place of generosity and love and wisdom. So there's this other quote that I thought was really good. And I can't remember exactly which sutta it came from. I just found it. I was going through a book earlier and I came across it. I was like, that's perfect. I'll put that in there for tonight. It says, I don't envision a single thing that when untamed, unguarded, unprotected, unrestrained, leads to such great harm as the mind. The mind, when untamed, unguarded, unprotected, unrestrained, leads to great harm. I don't envision a single thing that when tamed, guarded, protected, restrained, leads to such great benefit as the mind. The mind, when tamed, guarded, protected, restrained, leads to great benefit. So basically, the Buddha was saying, your mind can be your best friend or your worst enemy, right? So we should probably make friends with it.